This is the Roots and All Budcast, presented by Sarah Wilson.
Hello, and welcome to this week's Budcast. This week, I'm giving the whole episode over to houseplants. I've been doing quite a bit with my houseplants this week, so I thought they deserved their own episode. I'm going to whiz through a fair few different topics, so are you ready? Okay, let's go. First off, I wanted to list my favourite bomb-proof plants, in case you're new to houseplants or are one of those people with the habit of killing them. So if you have a brown thumb, I would go for a Monstera deliciosa or a Swiss cheese plant. You will have to try really hard to kill this plant. And next up is another Monstera, and this time it's the Monstera obliqua. It's definitely harder to get hold of than the Monstera deliciosa, but it's becoming more available as the demand for it increases. And like the deliciosa, it is a doddle to look after. It's tolerant of underwatering, its growth habit is attractive, and you can train it to grow up, down, or along things as it's a vine. It doesn't mind low light levels. It seems pretty pest proof, and it's easy to propagate by taking stem cuttings that contain a node with some roots attached, and you plonk them in water for a couple of months, and then you pot them into soil. And alternatively, if you want to find other ways of propagating plants that form aerial roots, do have a look at my blog post on this subject, which I put up recently. Next up is the aglaonema. I have Silver Queen, but I haven't come across one yet that doesn't tolerate all manner of abuse. It doesn't mind low light or erratic watering. It tolerates high temperatures, low temperatures, and it doesn't mind what humidity you have it in, whether it's dry air or damp air. Whatever you throw at this plant, it always looks so perfect that it could be fake. And then we've got the epipremnums, and I've got a few different cultivars of these, and they're all pretty tough. Like the Monsteras, they don't mind lack of water, low light levels, low humidity. Pests don't tend to bother them. In fact, as with the Monsteras, it might actually be in your best interest to treat them a bit mean. Otherwise, before you know it, they'll be wrapping themselves around every last inch of your house like some sort of triffid. And interestingly, both the Monsteras and the epipremnums are members of the Araceae family, known as the aroids. So it would seem that this could be a good family to go for if you're looking for a tough indoor plant. Next up is the Ficus pumila. This is another easy peasy plant. It just needs to be kept in fairly moist soil. It spreads itself around on creeping stems. And the only problem you might have here is that you need to prune it a bit to keep it in check. And it can also get a bit bald at the crown as the stems start to get longer and longer. So again, maybe propagating some of the stems might be prudent so you have a new supply if your parent plant gets a bit threadbare on top. The other way to combat this is to put the plant high up on a shelf so you only see the trailing stems and not the crown. And last but not least, we have the ZZ plant, which is short for the Zamioculcas zamiifolia. This is another plant you can completely ignore and it will be perfectly happy. Again, this plant will probably prefer to be ignored because it doesn't like to be overwatered and it does like to be pot bound. This is what keeps it producing close-knit stems. It's actually at its happiest when it's literally bursting its pot open. So this week I've been giving all my plants an inspection because I noticed an outbreak of mealybug on one and red spider mite on another. And it's always tough for me to deal with these outbreaks because I don't like to kill anything. With mealybugs, I generally wipe them off carefully with a cotton bud or a cocktail stick. Then I pop them outside. And at this time of the year, that's probably as good as killing them because I don't suppose they'll last long either without their food source or when the temperature drops, but I can't bring myself to squish them. And I wipe the red spider mites off with some damp cotton wool, which may well finish them off too, but I put the cotton wool on my compost heap and I kind of hope for the best. In the summer, of course, I just put any infected plants outdoors and let nature do my dirty work. And the other thing I'm going to do this week with my houseplants is put my turmeric plant to bed for the winter, which means I'll be letting it dry right out and cutting the leaves and stems down so there's about 5 centimetres left sticking up out of the soil. Then I'm going to stick them in an unheated greenhouse and I'm going to ignore them until probably around March or April when I'll start watering them again properly. And then I will probably water them a couple of times very lightly over the winter if we get any warm days. I haven't grown turmeric before and I don't know how it's going to respond, but I'm treating it like I would a ginger plant and keeping my fingers crossed that this will work because they're so similar. Oh, and I forgot to say, while I was inspecting the plants, I also cleaned the leaves, which is important in order to allow them to photosynthesize well. Shiny leaved plants get dusty, and if they're in a bathroom, they can get clogged up with the residues of things like spray deodorants and makeup. So it's really important to clean the leaves thoroughly. Again, I just do mine with warm water and a microfiber cloth. And the other thing I've done this week is planted up an indoor container. If you want to see a video of me doing this, check out my Instagram feed, which is Roots and All Pod, or check out my website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll find that and lots of other helpful info about indoor and outdoor plants. The main tip I have if you're planting up a container with indoor plants is to be really careful with your watering. If you're planting them directly into a container with no drainage, it's not really advisable to do this, but it is possible if you're super good at your watering or you tend to be on the tight-fisted side with the water, because if you overwater, there'll be no coming back. And the other thing is probably fairly obvious, but you do need to plant things together that like similar amounts of light, water, humidity, etc. So I'm just going to pop my plant buyer hat on for a minute and I'm going to gaze into my crystal ball. Like the rest of Britain, I am making no predictions as to what will happen after Brexit, but almost all our houseplants come from the continent. So it's highly likely that the price of houseplants will rise after Brexit, and it's possible there will be a smaller supply of them too. Now, I'm not suggesting everybody should stockpile houseplants, but I do think we've maybe got used to a plentiful and cheap supply of plants that might not be so available post-Brexit. The next thing I wanted to talk about is plant hygiene, which means being very careful about where you let your plants go and who you let them play with. In other words, plants are like people. They can spread diseases and bugs amongst themselves very easily, to the point where it has been known that if you go into a plant shop and you carry in plants that you may have bought in another shop, you might find the owner, if your plants are looking a little bit peaky, might say to you, please don't bring them in here. They're not being snooty. It's just that, if your plants look like they might not be in the best condition, it's probably prudent not to mix them with other plants that are healthy, because you'll be risking cross-contamination, and you should apply the same care at home when you get your plants home that you've just bought. So it's always a good idea to quarantine your plant if you can for a few weeks. Lots of house plants will come down with some infestation or another as soon as you get them home, and I don't know if that's because just as the plants get all warm and cozy in your home, so do the larvae or eggs of the pests, and you find they hatch out all over the place. But it could also be, and this is me being slightly cynical, that when they're grown in the nurseries, they're continually treated for pests and diseases, and when you buy them, these chemical treatments obviously stop and the pests and diseases are allowed to get a foothold and you end up dealing with the outbreak. So if you have other plants in the vicinity, these pests or diseases can easily transfer from one to the other, so it's a good idea to keep new plants away from your others for a while, and similarly keep any plants that are poorly away from your healthy ones. And this also goes, I think, for buying plants at places like car boot fairs, village fetes, markets, anywhere basically where the plants are being grown by amateurs. The chances are they are perfectly fine, but do be careful about importing nasty things in on new plant material or in the soil. I might sound as if I'm being a bit paranoid, but if you have a bit of a plant collection going on and you're a proud plant parent, it would be awful if your collection was damaged or even lost due to a pest or disease outbreak. So finally, after all that talk of pestilence, something a bit more cheerful. Last Tuesday was the 188th birthday of the botanical artist Marianne North, and if you're not aware of Marianne's work, I would urge you to look up her paintings online, but nothing quite compares to the first time you step into the Marianne North gallery at Kew Gardens, which is covered floor to ceiling in her paintings. Marianne bequeathed her paintings to Kew and paid for the gallery to be built there with the proviso that her paintings stayed in situ and that the gallery remained open to visitors. And she also stipulated that tea and coffee was to be served in the gallery, but the then director of Kew Gardens, Joseph Hooker, refused. So in her typical cheeky style, she painted a tea plant over one door and a coffee plant over another. Marianne was brave and intrepid, and she travelled the world by boat in the late 1800s, venturing deep into into the uncharted and untamed wilderness of much of the globe on her quest to find exotic plants and wildlife to paint. And the tie between Marianne and houseplants, although it's a bit tenuous, is that many of the exotic plants that she painted are things that we grow as house or conservatory plants and even garden plants today. So I wanted to finish with an excerpt from her diary, which she wrote during her last days when she retired to Alderley in Gloucestershire. Ill health forced her to stop travelling, and she only got to spend 4 years in her country house and garden before she passed away in 1890. And despite the journeys she undertook and the wonderful things she saw, she wrote in her final years, "No life is so charming as a country one in England, and no flowers are sweeter or more lovely than the primroses, cowslips, bluebells and violets which grow in abundance all around me here." Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next week.
For more information, visit the Roots and All website at rootsandall.co.uk. To download more episodes, visit iTunes, your favourite podcast provider, or get them direct from our website.